Okay, so I'm Subrata Ghoshroy. We are doing this IAP, myself, and this session with Yarden Katz. Yarden will be speaking on the main topic of artificial intelligence. So today, this is our second session, and I'll just do a little bit of a recap of the last session, and then make a few remarks about why the Pentagon is rushing to embrace artificial intelligence, and and then turn it over to Yarden. So last time we looked at the various aspects of budgets, etc. So I'll talk just a little bit about the recap. But before that, the evolution in terms of Pentagon's drive towards seeking a technology edge or technology dominance, whatever way you want to look at it. But the main thing is the U.S. military dominance in the world based on technology in the post-Second World War era. So they call it the offsets, and so I'll talk a little bit about that. But I also point out that this whole business of the illusion, I think, is that technology is a panacea. Technology can provide you the silver bullet that you can use in the battlefield, and that'll prove to be decisive. It has not. In particular, since the end of the Cold War, we see battlefields that are very different, where all these technology we have, all these hardware, weaponry we have, is not helping us really win. I mean, we can destroy countries, certainly. We can kill somebody by a drone attack and so forth, but it is not helping attain the main goal of the U.S. As a nation, as an empire, which is a domination. So the artificial intelligence is basically the final episode of that, not the final episode, but the most current episode in terms of introducing GWIS technology to build GWIS weapons. So as far as the last week, we talked about the federal budget, and I introduced some people who are not familiar with the numbers, that we are talking about trillions of dollars. $4.7 trillion is our federal budget, of which 1.3 trillion is so-called discretionary, meaning it is subject to debate in Congress. And I argued that within that $1.3 trillion, we have $733 billion as the defense budget, and the rest, 600 or so billion, is for all other rest of the programs, from healthcare to education to commerce to NASA to you name it. So very small amounts of money when it comes to many programs that are of social need. And this doesn't come, this huge defense spending and large budget deficits don't come without a price. I mean, we do have to pay a price for it, which is, if you look at the federal budget and look at the one section of the mandatory spending, is $479 billion, which is the interest on debt. We have tremendous debt. The debt is nearly approaching the GDP, and the budget deficits are also phenomenal. So it doesn't come for free, and all the other programs are deprived, and we pay a huge amount of money in debt servicing. And then I said, why this condition goes on? So the reason that this is possible, with the defense budget going up, almost in a monotonic way, and that it cannot be stopped, even though a lot of the weapons we don't need, we're still building. And I introduced the notion of the much cliched military-industrial complex and showed some charts about what it comprises of and why the U.S. foreign policy in these endless wars are dictated by the necessities and the dictums from this military-industrial complex. So if you want to look at the last lecture, as I said, it is now available on Radius website. And then I also talked about, besides the unnecessary part of it and these opportunity costs lost to fight climate, or otherwise we don't have the money to do that research, is the failure of the programs. Many programs are extremely wasteful, and I personally had worked in this business in Congress on the House Armed Services Committee and the House International Relations Committee, and also later on with the Government Accountability Office, which reviews these programs. And we wrote many reports and many things showing the waste of these programs, and not much is happening. So it's the power of the military-industrial complex and its influence on our politics and congressmen and women. And so I think I made these points. There's one thing I forgot to mention, which is the issue of the arms trade, that the corporate profits certainly drive the military-industrial complex, huge profits. If you look at the stock market, look at the stocks of major defense contractors, Lockheed, Raytheon, Grumman, Northrop, these companies, and you'll see, and also other types of defense contractors like SAIC, which are sort of this so-called Beltway, Washington Beltway bandits, make enormous amounts of money from contracts from the government. Edward Snowden is a product of one of those companies. And so they make enormous amounts of money from contracts, but the companies also then make, manufacturers that is primarily, but now also software services too, that in the arms sales, we are the world's biggest arms salesman. So basically the drive in the world arms market is also primarily led by the United States. Out of a $400 billion, this is like a couple of years ago, $400 billion in arms sales, whether it's missiles, rockets, ships, boats, things of that sort, we are at the top of the heap, and our share is about over 50%, 57%. Second is Russia, which is way smaller than us. So these arms profits, and it's one thing to also point out that in the case of the arms sales, the companies make all the profits. MIT is the home of startup companies, and we know that that we get a lot of venture capital, and we know also how difficult the conditions the venture capitalists put on startup companies, etc. Government, especially the Pentagon, is the most friendly venture capitalists that you can ever find, because they don't put any conditions. You can waste any amount of money on any kind of technology you just propose. I remember, like, if you write a proposal to DARPA, DARPA is the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, and MIT gets a lot of money from DARPA. There's many program managers are very friendly with them. It's very easy to get money. If you are a professor in a top-notch school like MIT or Johns Hopkins or Columbia or UCLA, what have you, you can write a proposal to DARPA, which would be like a 5-pager max, and you can get several $1 million relatively quickly. These programs are fast-tracked and so forth. So it's really a very easy money that these companies get from the venture capital that is the United States. And now in the artificial intelligence, this is happening also in the context of Schwarzman Center, etc. So there's a lot of motive to continue these huge military budget, huge arms manufacturing sales for selling to Saudi Arabia and UAE, etc., and make lots and lots of money. And Trump was very open about this thing. He had White House pictures taken with all the stuff we were selling to Saudi Arabia. So, but again, going back to this, the drive for a technological superiority for a global domination, it first started really with the nuclear weapon in 1941-42 timeframe. So in 45 we had the nuclear weapon, and then this whole thing with the military-industrial complex really got started with that. And I also call that is a sort of a turning point in the relationship between the universities and the military. It's the first time during the Second World War, and particularly the Manhattan Project, that solidified this connection between the Pentagon and that continued since so 70 years. The Cold War paradigm of huge defense spending, close connection between the science and the military has not abated at all. It's continuing. But that was called the first offset, meaning we have the monopoly now for a few years. 1945 is our detonation in Trinity, and 1949 is the detonation of the fission bomb by Soviet Union. So in 4 years, we had total monopoly of this miracle weapon that is so devastating, and so it really turned the heads of many of our military planners who think they could just dominate the world because we have this weapon that nobody else can have. Of course, that was not true. So 4 years later, the Soviets had it. So, and then the race towards constant superiority by accelerating the warhead production, and by the time 1960s came around, we had tens of thousands of weapons on both sides until they realized that it was absolute madness. And the second offset, it happened with the electronic revolution, that actually this is one time or one example of very fast-paced military programs created fantastic technology that then also got transferred to the commercial sector. So we have very fast electronics, and that led to the computers and satellite communications, all these things that gave us a huge advantage over the Soviets on the second offset. Soviet really could not compete with the quality of the United States weapons. The third one is now, and that is the 21st century offset, which is primarily using artificial intelligence in unmanned systems, in drones, and so forth, that Yarden is going to talk about. One more word, I guess, about the electronic revolution. And one thing I want to point out, that it gave the United States a tremendous advantage, no doubt about it. But and the Russians couldn't do it. They didn't have not the large infrastructure of R&D we did in our services and outside services. We had Bell Labs. We had all the service labs in the Army, Navy, and the Air Force. And that helped develop this technology. And we also had the commercial sector pushing in commercializing, which of course was making the components better, faster, and in quantity, so eventually cheaper. Russia didn't have that, so they fell way behind that. But so they tried to make it up with volume, with heavier weapons and many more people in uniform and so forth. And so this is the third offset. This is a picture of Secretary of Defense at the time, Ash Carter, in the middle in blue coat. Ash Carter was, of course, is now again back at Harvard at the Kennedy School, and so he was here. He was meeting with folks at Silicon Valley when he was opening one of the centers of excellence for.
Do you know who any of the other people are?
Do I know any other people?
Any of the people?
No, I think these are people from Google and elsewhere. The the center is in Silicon Valley, yeah, near Google, and so they call it in the typical Pentagon verbiage. It's called DIUX, which is Defense Innovation Unit Experimental. That's their new name for these fast-paced, small facilities they're building in different parts of the country to tap into the university talent, and in some cases, outside university high-tech company talents to help them building and doing what Carter called this centaur mythology of half animal, half human, warrior. And so now we have half artificial intelligence, half human. And it's set up, as I said, in 4 places. The first one was at Google and Stanford, I just showed. The next one was in Cambridge, and the other 2 are in Austin, Texas, at the semiconductor complex, and at the Pentagon itself in Virginia. And Boston set up the 4th facility. I haven't actually seen it, so they're keeping it relatively under the radar. It is in Kendall Square somewhere, and if somebody has seen it, I'd like to see it. But I mean, not that there is anything particular. It's probably just some people running some contracts. But regardless, so it has apparently very large sums of money assigned to it as venture capital funds to boost startups. And I was reading just a newspaper article, and they are citing some companies like Recorded Future, Shield AI, Carbon Black. Yarden, do you know any of these companies?
I've heard of some of them.
Okay, yeah. Okay. And we expect much interaction between DIUX and our Schwarzman Center. So I know the students have been protesting at Schwarzman Center in the beginning when Henry Kissinger came and so forth. And there's a lot of protests, of course, against Media Lab's connection to Jeffrey Epstein. So these will go on. But MIT is very closely tied to the Pentagon and with all these things. I won't talk about this, but this I will post them again at the Radius. And I've done just a list of this whole business of this illusion of capturing the proverbial technology high ground, and how many of these, in terms of like we find something special like a stealth aircraft or whatever, and we quickly use them in all kinds of conditions to try them out, inventing enemies, and many of the time mostly going after enemies who cannot really retaliate. Like one example was just going with the F-117 stealth fighter. We introduced that in Panama in 1989. And Panama, at that time, it was under General Noriega. And Panama did not even have anything more than rifles. And imagine F-117 coming in saying, oh, we are coming in under the radar. What radar? I mean, so they have to try this out. So you make this fantastic technology, you got to try them out. So you find wars to try them out. So I've done a list, and you can go through the list. And the latest, of course, again, is the artificial intelligence. So with that, I introduce Yarden Katz. Yarden, you want to come up? And Yarden is a PhD in course 9 in neuroscience from MIT, and is about to publish a book on artificial intelligence by Columbia University Press. It'll be coming out towards the end of the year. And he's now at Harvard Medical School doing both biology and artificial intelligence. So he'll have a lot of interesting things to say. So with that, thank you.
Okay, thanks very much for having me, Subrata. It's really an honor for me to be here. I really admire Subrata's efforts over the years to draw attention to the military-industrial complex and its very destructive effects on our lives. So it's great to be here. I sat in on this course before as a student. So I'll read my remarks today because there's a lot to cover, and it's a very confusing topic, and time is short. So artificial intelligence is capturing many minds, as I'm sure you know. Vladimir Putin famously declared, "Whoever leads in AI will rule the world." Governments have rushed to draft national plans on AI. Even museums are now exploring the nature of art in what is nonchalantly referred to as the age of AI. The media talks about it nonstop. Are we good? Okay, so an industry of experts has emerged from the academic and policy worlds to interpret AI's significance for the world. And to give you some of the examples, according to these experts, AI could, on, I guess, the positive side, grow the economy, free people from labor, help address climate change, remove the so-called bias from the courts of law, automate scientific discovery, reinvent journalism and hence democracy, and maybe even produce super intelligent machines that would colonize the galaxy. These are all from the experts, I'm not making it up. But if it's improperly cultivated, they have really dismal outcomes in store for us. AI could widen social inequality, create a global underclass, launch a new arms race, bring about bloodier wars through so-called autonomous weapons, and multiple media reports say that AI might, kill all of us, maybe sooner rather than later. So my point is that, as is often the case with matters concerning technology and science, this conversation is deeply ahistorical. So many are willing to pontificate about AI's benefits and its risks, but very few people ask, what is AI? And even if we know what it is, why are we talking about it so much now? What is the timing of AI's sudden rise? So to the extent that this question does arise, it's shrugged off as obvious, because the ready-made answer is we have larger data sets and we have better computers, and maybe there are also some revolutionary algorithms that have been developed. Okay, so these breakthroughs, according to the prevailing narrative, have led to a state where computers rival, maybe will soon exceed the capacities of human thought. So this is the received wisdom. AI is a coherent and powerful force. It's made possible by recent breakthroughs in computing. And we have to face it now, and we must manage it because it's poised to change everything. So this received wisdom obscures the phenomena it purports to explain, I would argue, and the fact that these critical questions about AI's timing are not being discussed, in my view, is as important to making sense of this phenomena of AI as anything having to do with algorithms or data or computers. So I've completed a book on this topic that looks at AI's history, and this is a very complex topic, so I'll only address a tiny sliver of the politics and ideology of AI today. And my argument in a nutshell is this. AI isn't a coherent general-purpose technology with many applications, but rather it's a technology of power. And the nebulous character of this endeavor, which has been there from the start, has made it amenable to reconfigurations in the service of capitalist and imperial aims. And AI was continually being reorganized by its practitioners and their patrons to be that which can serve American empire, or empire in general. And this practice actually cuts across all these commonly heard distinctions between AI's computing systems, like the symbolic versus the statistical, or the emergent versus the top-down, or whatever. So in other words, what I'd like to argue is that AI's nebulosity and its malleability is a feature, not a bug. It helps these reconfigurations. And as a technology of power, AI has been consistently used to advance destructive imperial projects, to sanction further investments into weapons, to argue against policies that threaten capital accumulation, and to rebrand the fruits of the military-industrial complex in response to resistance from social movements. And we'll see some of that today. Okay, so a little bit of history. So from the moment the term was coined in 1956 by the logician John McCarthy, AI was both nebulous and contested. McCarthy never actually defined the term. He just used it. And there was never any agreement, even among practitioners, as to what this endeavor is about, what AI is, and what its goals should be. This was always under challenge. And the decision to coin the term AI for that particular moment in time was itself a product of a rift between cybernetics and AI, which you can think of as two disciplines that have a lot to say about human nature and are both vying for attention and funds from the war machine, the American war machine. So since AI's incoherence or nebulous foundation was a source of tension, AI practitioners dealt with that by allying themselves with the Pentagon's elites. And these elites were charmed by the term artificial intelligence, and they poured money into the field. So contrary to narratives of the so-called AI winter, the Pentagon has actually steadily funded AI since the 1960s, from the office of IPTO at DARPA. And starting in the 60s, noted AI practitioners at MIT, such as John McCarthy before he moved to Stanford, and Marvin Minsky, received unrestricted funds from the Pentagon. In an interview later, Minsky reflected, he said, quote, "It was heaven. It was your philanthropic institute run by your students with no constraints and no committees," end quote. Okay. Up until the early 1970s, essentially all of DARPA's AI grants, based on my analysis, were given to just MIT and Stanford, just two institutions. And for a while, the funding was still highly concentrated. So between 1970 and 1980, MIT, Stanford, and Stanford's Research Institute, SRI, received over 70% of the funds. Okay. So this alliance gave the field a kind of superficial coherence and force, and it made AI practitioners very eager to enlist in the Pentagon's missions. But money wasn't actually enough to resolve this fundamental problem of what AI actually is. And critics would constantly raise questions in the background most of the time. Is AI, questions like these, is AI a science or an engineering discipline? Is it a quest to automate narrowly defined tasks of industrial production? How is AI different from other disciplines that use computational simulation for so-called rational decision-making, notably economics, which has in a history very intertwined with that of AI? In the 1960s and 70s, there were attacks by the philosopher Hubert Dreyfus, as well as by the mathematician James Lighthill. All of this continued, and in the 1990s, one computer scientist wrote, quote, "Commercial AI is now big business, but AI itself is full of fundamental unresolved problems. So what exactly is being marketed here?" End quote. So these problems would never go away. But AI practitioners coped with these issues by reorganizing their field around an imperial agenda. Nonetheless, some AI practitioners, like MIT professor Joseph Weizenbaum, who was also an AI practitioner, questioned their field's subservience to the Pentagon. So Weizenbaum argued in the mid-1980s that the military essentially presents its aims in vague enough terms to cover every branch of AI, and then AI practitioners do the work of situating their projects within that militarized frame. As Weizenbaum pointed out, for instance, the DARPA's Strategic Computing Initiative in the 1980s had three wings: the battle management, the autonomous vehicle, and the pilot's assistant. And these were designed to capture, as he said, quote, "almost every branch of work in AI." Weizenbaum, unlike many of his colleagues, rejected the idea that the military's sort of vague-sounding rubric could give practitioners intellectual freedom to do whatever they like. Rather, he argued, AI practitioners sculpt their research so as to serve this militarized agenda, so much so that students who want to pursue a different course won't be able to find advisors. AI is so beholden to its military masters, he wrote, that, quote, "what we get, of course, like little dogs sitting under the table, feeding on the bones that our masters drop, very occasionally what we get is wristwatches and things of that kind. And somehow we think that this is a natural process," end quote. This dynamic, according to Weizenbaum, is the, quote, "fallout of gigantic efforts to make it possible to kill more and more people ever more efficiently." Okay, so AI's promoters, in addition to framing their field around this imperial agenda, also presented AI as critical to US hegemony. And they tended to promise over time, and you can see these narratives being recycled, that an investment in a particular technological arena, like specialized hardware, could finally unlock AI's great powers. So the American reaction to Japan's state-sponsored AI project is telling. This is in the early 1980s. Japan's ministry had announced its so-called fifth generation project, a plan to revamp the economy using AI. And the plan included building specialized hardware for running computing systems of the sort that leading AI practitioners at the time, like Edward Feigenbaum at Stanford, were building. So these experts, led mostly by Edward Feigenbaum, framed Japan as an imperial enemy that is seeking to steal American technology. And this narrative should sound familiar to you from nowadays. And they led this kind of horrifically racist propaganda campaign to drum up resources for a counter plan on the American side. And they wrote a book about Japan's program called The Fifth Generation. The book's cover features a figure that embodies the kind of Orientalist conceptions of Japan as an imperial enemy. It is the Statue of Liberty, but the face of Libertas is replaced with a face wearing the traditional makeup and hairstyle of a geisha. The figure's right arm is robotic, not human. In this image, the Japanese enemy has not only encroached on American liberty, but has done so by colonizing the body of the free, white Western woman. In this way, Feigenbaum and his co-author reproduce the patriarchal arc of white supremacist narratives in which the white woman stands for a kind of white purity and a masculine force, in this case the Pentagon's elite technocrats, have to defend her from attack by this racialized enemy. And in fact, when Feigenbaum testified to the US Congress to justify the plan that would fund his own research program in reaction to this, he said, maintaining supremacy in AI is, quote, the manifest destiny of computing. So these narratives are repeated today, as you probably have noticed, with the US and China. In the summer of 2017, the Chinese government unveiled a plan to integrate AI into its military and civilian affairs, and it stirred panic within the US and academic establishment. The Chinese plan led the US government to even consider limiting China's involvement with American companies. Following these developments, then U.S. Defense Secretary James Mattis, Mr. Mad Dog, called on the Pentagon to work more closely with Silicon Valley corporations in developing AI. And by the following year, the Pentagon had committed $2 billion to building an AI center. So nowadays, AI is still framed as a struggle between competing empires. So for instance, MIT Technology Review, a magazine owned by MIT, said that China's dependence on foreign materials for integrated circuits could potentially cripple its AI ambitions, but, quote, AI itself could change all of that. New types of chips are being invented to fully exploit advances in AI, end quote, and China might be, quote, reinventing microchips for the first time in ages. So here we have another instantiation of this, what I call the magical chip narrative, that specialized hardware for the day's leading computing paradigm would unlock AI's great powers, and so we have to rush to get there first. And the current struggle over AI is taken to reflect today, as it was then, a greater imperial struggle. So MIT Technology Review warns that, quote, China's chip ambitions could have geopolitical implications. If successful, China's hypothetical chip industry would make the nation, quote, more economically competitive and therefore threaten U.S., quote, national strength and security. And of course, nowadays, with AI being so popular, it's being used to sell drones and rebrand drones. And the myth that war is an autonomous, computerized affair, almost standing outside the control of human beings, just recharges these drone manufacturers' existing projects. They sold drones before, they're selling them again, but now these are AI-powered drones. Okay, so mainstream media coverage broadly equates supremacy in AI with global hegemony. So the Washington Post, for instance, refers to China as two competing superpowers at battle for AI. Another Washington Post piece says that now the U.S. is facing, quote, the Chinese threat that an aircraft carrier can't stop, and suggested that China's investments in AI will require a, quote, more nimble Pentagon. So again, we have this pretext for expanding the military-industrial complex. And this rhetoric, of course, reflects what Edward Said identified as the, quote, cultural consensus among U.S. intellectual elites in which, quote, American leadership and exceptionalism is never absent. So in the past, Said says, when overt colonial imperial relations were more acceptable, people would use talk like manifest destiny, but today they use talk like, quote, world responsibility, but this logic is the same. The US has to lead the world for the world's own good. And AI is a convenient vehicle for this doctrine in more sanitized form, as we'll see. Okay. So that was a little bit of history, but in the 2010s, AI forcefully kind of reappeared in mainstream discourses, and it's worth historicizing that moment a little bit and asking who profited from it. So while AI drew great media attention several decades before the 2010s, in the mid-1980s and the early 1990s, interest then sort of dwindled. And it was only around 2013 that AI started getting mentioned a lot in academic journals and mainstream media. And at this period, an expert industry has assembled around AI. As new initiatives formed, existing institutes also changed focus. And so the label's nebulosity facilitated a very rapid uptake of AI labels. So legal scholars that might have worked on copyright law, for example, would now work on AI in copyright. Artists would work on AI in art, journalists, AI in journalism, defense intellectuals, AI in national security. It's a good fit. So the expert industry reoriented itself around AI. And the core premise of these emergent experts is that AI is a coherent and transformative force. It's reshaping all of society. And this premise transcends, I think, very superficial left-right divides. But what was the context of AI's rise at this moment in time? And I think we have to look at the year 2013 just to contextualize it. So in June of 2013, Edward Snowden exposed the systems of global mass surveillance operated by the NSA, which have shocked many citizens. Snowden's disclosures showed the complicity of major platform companies in surveillance projects. So Microsoft, for instance, installed a backdoor in its Skype messaging system for the NSA, while companies including Google, Facebook, Yahoo, Apple, and AOL allow the NSA to eavesdrop on their servers as part of this PRISM program. And these disclosures, I would say, altered mainstream discourse on Silicon Valley and on surveillance, and they catalyzed protests worldwide. Now, Snowden's disclosures foretold in a way the downfall of Silicon Valley's kind of big data doctrine. So this idea that having more data collected centrally by the likes of Google is universally beneficial. And scholars and media commentators began referring to things like surveillance capitalism. And the idea that platform companies were exploiting their users' data for profit and political gain sort of became a kind of common sense. But the term artificial intelligence, at least temporarily, with its nebulous air, refreshed this big data narrative that we were used to hearing before. Okay, so AI is suggestive of futuristic machines that may do things better than people. It's a more cerebral term than big data, which following Snowden started conjuring up this sense of centralized systems that collect data generated by us, the users. And the appeal to AI helped to mask, again, temporarily, how platform companies both enable and profit from mass surveillance and behavior modification. Indeed, when AI catapulted into the mainstream in the early 2010s, it was often framed, as in earlier iterations, around theoretical cognitive issues, are machines going to outdo us, surpass us, but mostly kept apart from discussions of surveillance and the national security state. In short, AI became a new label for Silicon Valley's existing agenda of world governance by big data. Corporations actually played a major role in this rebranding of AI by hiring academics who worked on familiar and profitable data analysis tasks to head new AI labs. Okay, so this included academics who may not have even used the term AI before to describe their own work, but now they were heading these AI labs. In 2018, Google even renamed its entire research division from Google Research to Google AI, and what takes place inside arguably hasn't changed. In fact, the expert industry cynically recognized this rebranding maneuver. If you look at what journalists who call themselves AI journalists post online, they poke fun at how AI is a rebranding of machine learning, is a rebranding of statistics or whatever. Yet the newly formed AI initiatives provide a progressive veneer, I would say, for a very familiar agenda by using abstractions like ethical AI or doing good or notions such as algorithmic accountability or algorithmic justice. And this progressive veneer has been used to cement a web of partnerships across academic, corporate, and state sectors. These partnerships are premised on a neoliberal model of governance framed around partnerships and stakeholders. And universities have been moving towards this model for decades, but AI is a way to double down on it, in effect. All the partners around this AI initiative share the ideological commitment that AI is a coherent and powerful force, and that we must manage it, and they view partnerships among the so-called stakeholders, which are the corporations, the military, universities, nonprofits, and this amorphous entity, the public, as universally beneficial. So the more we can expand this web, the better, and that's a way to ensure that AI is put to good use. And since AI is reshaping everything, that the experts now create space for themselves to write policy and oversee unbounded political and social arena. You can see this neoliberal model of governance through things like the Partnership on AI, which brings together all of these corporations and the military and so forth. How am I doing on time here? In this process, again, just to illustrate another theme without getting into too many details, the idea that AI is being used as a pretext for existing things can be seen in discussions about the economy, where AI experts essentially recycle narratives from the 1980s that AI will be this versatile slave force, so they use a very racialized metaphor. It'll be this great slave force that will free us from burdens of labor. And they use that as a vehicle for then arguing for various neoliberal policies. So this is a typical example, a book about AI and the economy. It says, AI will expand the economy so much that we don't need to take away from the wealthy and redistribute wealth. We just need to distribute this, ever-expanding pie more broadly. And when the book, which is ostensibly about AI, turns to, well, how are we going to actually distribute the wealth more equally, the author just repeats Milton Friedman. It's just, let's cut taxes for the corporations. And I mean, literally, he cites Milton Friedman, and he says, let's forget Social Security. It's a monolithic system. It's, it's terrible. Okay, so it's really not about AI. It's about neoliberalism in this case. Okay. But so what I want to emphasize is that this web of partnerships, as it expands around AI, it gives corporations and the military, of course, more control over the lines of inquiry. But these nebulous-sounding initiatives actually sanction very concrete and practical developments in the world. So it's not just hot air, and it would be wrong. I shy away from using hype for AI as a term, just as a side note, because hype suggests that you have a technology, it has many applications, and maybe the value of this technology is a little bit inflated or exaggerated. But I think this framing is very misleading for AI because it's so nebulous and malleable, and because of these concrete initiatives that are actually a sharp contrast to the nebulosity of the endeavor as a whole. So these nebulous sounding initiatives like ethical AI or doing AI for good help sanction projects that universities and their partners have long been engaged in. These include projects of dispossession and land accumulation. And we can use a local example here. We can use the MIT Schwarzman College of Computing. So this new college was named after Stephen Schwarzman, the billionaire CEO of Blackstone Group, a company that MIT has since described as, quote, a leading global asset manager. And MIT already had numerous corporate partnerships around AI, but this is, of course, the largest one. Schwarzman says that he's invested in AI in order to build, quote, ethical AI that will work to everyone's benefit. He's done the same with University of Oxford, by the way. And in the spring of 2018, MIT celebrated the new college in a kind of lavish gathering that included venture capitalists, diplomats, and national security elites, including, of course, Henry Kissinger, who is Schwarzman's longtime partner in foreign policy ventures. But as Schwarzman was being honored by MIT, his Blackstone Group was continuing to displace people across the world. In North and South America, Asia, In Europe, Blackstone has acquired buildings and converted these into rental units, which tenants have demonstrated are often entirely uninhabitable and dangerous. As the company then spikes up the rents, it ruthlessly evicts those who cannot pay. And in the US, Blackstone has been also fighting against rent control measures very aggressively in California, for instance. The UN Housing Advisor has flagged Blackstone, in fact, as a major contributor to a global housing crisis in which tenants increasingly find themselves at the mercy of, quote, faceless corporations. Blackstone also extended its reaches into the Amazon rainforest. Blackstone-owned firms develop ports and roads, which fuel the hostile takeover of lands by agribusiness in that region, and they damage indigenous land and sovereignty. This is not surprising because Schwarzman and other financial elites in New York are tied to both Brazil's President Jair Bolsonaro and to Donald Trump, who are both committed to making Brazil white again and the US white again. Moreover, Blackstone Group also manages the assets of the Saudi Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, who I'm sure all of you know. MIT had ousted a year earlier and formed partnerships with his government while he was waging a devastating war in Yemen. So the point is that universities that form these new initiatives engage in actually the same projects of land accumulation, dispossession, and gentrification as their patrons and now partners in AI. Universities, wealthy universities, also convert lands into real estate all over the world. They're in fact also built on stolen indigenous land through land grants, for instance. As was recently documented for Harvard, which is a very extreme example. Harvard owns something like 400,000 hectares across the world, farmlands in South America, Africa, Eastern Europe, and other places, New Zealand. So the rebranded AI's initiative essentially worked to sanction these pursuits and the entities behind them. This web of partnership, of course, also imposes political uniformity on the university's major activities. So when Stanford sort of launched its own version of the Schwarzman College, it was dominated by the same people. So you had McKinsey and you had Google and you had Microsoft all sending their employees to become fellows at the center. Schwarzman and Kissinger were in the audience, as well as former CEO Eric Schmidt, who's MIT's go-to advisor on all things related to computing. Okay. So I've talked about the politics and the ideology and AI as a kind of vehicle and a pretext for recharging already existing things that were already set in motion, in contrast to this idea that AI is some entirely novel thing, a product of technology and technological progress. So of course these initiatives and the force of AI depends not just on sheer power, but also on fictitious ideas about the human mind and about the nature of intelligence. So what I would call epistemic forgeries. And I'm reminded here of a nice quote about Edward Said, who was analyzing Orientalist discourses and the way that various Western thinkers have presented the Orient. And he said, no merely asserted generality is denied the dignity of truth. And you can really see that in the discourse of AI. People attribute fantastical and magical things to AI. So if you look at the history of the field, AI has consistently tried to pass as quote, universal, what is in fact a white, masculine, and very narrow perspective on intelligence, as thinkers such as Alison Adam have pointed out. They've produced racialized, gendered, and classed understandings of the self, which were used to argue that AI rivals and may soon surpass the capacities of human thought. In doing this, AI practitioners essentially extrapolated from their narrow work on military aims or on profitable tasks like predicting ad clicks to general intelligence and human nature in the broadest sense. And we can see this in the discourse, for instance, of Google's company DeepMind, where they say we're going to solve intelligence and use it to solve everything. And what they in fact offer is a very narrow behaviorist view of intelligence, which claims that intelligence is a product of reinforcement, punishments, and rewards from the environment. And the company routinely does this extrapolation move, taking so-called successes, which are actually vastly exaggerated in and of themselves, successes in narrow domains such as games, and saying this is going to help us solve everything, understand the nature of scientific inquiry, and so forth. As in AI's past iterations, the newly celebrated AI systems are constructed in a way that makes them useful for lucrative tasks, but that actually neglect the historical and political aspects of human life, which AI practitioners routinely excised from their models of the human self. And we can see that in some examples of Google systems, like the system Show and Tell, which is an image captioning system trained on data, which is manually annotated, and that's a whole other story, but we don't have time to get into that. So I obtained this trained model, and I tried to run it on some images that are a little bit different from the kind of generic stock-like images that Google uses to demonstrate its own work. So consider, for example, a photograph of Palestinians arriving at a checkpoint operated by Israeli soldiers. Okay, this figure on the left, a Palestinian man is instructed to lift his shirt to show the soldier that he's unarmed. And Google's system gave this image the caption, quote, "a group of people standing on top of a snow-covered slope." So for a statistical pattern recognizer, of course, the light dirt on the hill might look like snow, but the sun, the clothing, the relationship among those people photographed makes that a totally absurd description. Similarly, if you look at a photograph, a very iconic 1960 photograph of a black girl named Ruby Bridges, 6-year-old being accompanied by U.S. Marshals to a desegregated school because of threats of violence. This is registered as a group of men standing next to each other. Okay? So it isn't possible to make sense of these of group scenes either without history, right? So if you look at these images, so the image on the left is an image of Palestinians praying in protest outside the mosque at the Dome of the Rock. This is registered by the system as a crowd of people standing around a parking lot filled with kites, which again, from a statistical recognition perspective, the colorful shirts maybe look like kites. Similarly, a 1960 photograph from South Africa's apartheid regime in which black men line up to receive passports from a panel of all-white officials is captioned as a black and white photograph of a group of people, completely missing the dynamic here, obviously.
Pass books, not passports.
Passbooks, sorry. Passbooks. The history of gender oppression cannot be ignored either. An ad from the 1960s where a woman is used as ashtray support for a man smoking a cigar is captioned as a black and white photograph of a woman wearing a tie. You can see a similar image here. Just to make the point that, of course, how you interpret this depends on your position in society, your understanding of histories of oppression. Okay. So I want to just conclude by saying that AI's nebulous core has made it malleable, and the expert industry around it has continually recreated AI to be whatever is the thing that could advance imperial aims. And this practice, I would argue, transcends commonly drawn distinctions between AI systems, such as symbolic versus statistical, or centralized versus emergent. And this imperial agenda is reflected both in the social organization of AI as a field and also in its epistemologies, the kinds of models that it serves up of human nature. So I think that for people who are interested in resisting the projects and visions that AI sanctions, I think it's worthwhile to deflate the idea that AI is a coherent and powerful force thrown upon us by the wind of techno-progress, and to challenge the expert industry that profits from selling this fiction. And I think this means not only challenging AI's epistemologies and problematic models of the self, but also the institutions that continually stage AI's so-called revolutions. Okay, thank you.